So I'm going to be talking about the risks and modelling the opportunity in transforming or transformational website projects. And as you'll see in a minute, that encompasses all sorts of different processes that you might be undertaking or planning. This is genuinely the boring bit. There's quite a lot of data and modelling in this one, but I think it's quite fundamental to emphasise that in a project like this, you need a certain degree of planning up front. So we've got lots of ideas about how you can sort of plan a project of this complexity. And these are the kind of things we're talking about. I mean, first of all, you don't undertake a migration for its own sake. There are going to be specific reasons, specific outcomes that you want to achieve from it. So we'll go through that. Then I go through a catalogue of the risk and what I call a bestiary of changes. So that's going through all the different details, the ingredients, as it were, of your project and what you might need to consider within that. As you'll see from that, it can be quite a complex process, and there are very many different flavours of that. So through this presentation, I'm going to be talking about different approaches, whether you do everything all at once as part of a big bang process, or whether you actually stagger out your migration and have it, let's say, staged over 6, 12 months or whatever time frame. I think we're going to very much come down on the view that a staged migration, if you've got a lot of non-branded organic traffic, that is going to be less risk and easier to manage from a resource point of view, but I'll give you the detail as we come on to that. Then we look at other factors that you may need to model into your migration and the measurement, both the measurement to understand how your site performs prior to the migration and the measurement afterwards to see what the impact is. And I'm going to talk about seasonal and cyclical changes that may have to form part of your calculations there. We go into a little more detail about the risk and then talk about, again, my favourite topic, measurement, and lots of boring data stuff. And then a little thing right at the end is a migration checklist. So typically for pre-migration and post-migration phases, you might have checklists that run into the hundreds of items and tasks. Some could take a few hours, some could take days or even weeks to undertake. Well, this is a good place to start of some of the main considerations. So let's get on to why are you doing this? Well, you may be coming at the problem from a number of different angles, but we think these encompass a lot of the scenarios that we've actually worked with. Now, growth, especially in e-commerce, is going to be a priority. And often the background of a migration project will be that your brand experts, your designers, UX experts, they may all promise that the outcome of migration will be that your site traffic increases. Sometimes they may not even qualify that. They may suggest that it almost happens overnight. Unfortunately, in our experience, that's rarely the case. Growth can come as a result of one of these transformational projects, but the time scale is often weeks, months, sometimes longer than that, even if the project has laid the foundations for that growth. From a migration project itself, with my SEO head on, the best outcome would be to stabilize or keep the stability of your traffic, the stability of your rankings, and perhaps improve user journeys. So we're certainly going to talk a lot about stability. We're going to talk a lot about risk mitigation, which I think is a huge part of why you might bring an SEO expert on board to help you with your migration process. And then this is the idea of transformation. It does help, we think, that if you have growth in mind, you will also have major change also encompassed within that. And it does help to have a growth agenda, but keep it separate from your migration checklists. Because once the migration is out of the way, it really does help to have a vision for where your site's going to go. And some of those visionary changes can be implemented in parallel with the migration process, as long as they're checked that they're not actually going to interfere with your search rankings or damage the migration process itself. So yeah, this is a little bit sort of black and white, this slide here. So SEO apocalypse or search paradise. It sounds a little bit alarmist, but unfortunately when you look at the industry case studies, and this covers information sites, news sites, e-commerce sites, there are cases in every industry sector where a migration of one sort or another has not been planned for, and the expectation has not been set, and what's happened is a decline, for example, of up to 40% of non-brand traffic. Now, for most businesses, that's something that gets the attention at board level, especially if the expectation has not been set that that might be one of the outcomes. And we've seen those scenarios. Thankfully, none of our customers have experienced that, in large part down to the mitigating strategies. But there are many worst case scenarios, and it does help to map out what those might be and put in place the mitigating strategies. I think paradise is probably overselling it a little bit, but if you come out of the migration process and your rankings haven't slipped and your traffic is stable and your users are more engaged with your site, then I think that for us all is a good place to be. So what are the different flavours of migration? And again, using the sort of stick as opposed to carrot imagery there, I've put sort of horrible weapons of destruction against each one. But these are some of the main migration processes that you may be contemplating. Some sites will be doing these separately, some sites will be doing just one of these, some sites will contemplate in doing all of these at the same time. And I think the risk increases exponentially the more of these you try to encompass within the same project. So domain migrations are the big one. And we'll put some more detail on that in a second. But clearly, if you're moving from one domain to another, that is a huge risk to your search engine equity. It's a huge risk to your rankings. And often, if you're changing domain, you'll probably be changing the sort of UX, URLs, content, design, front end, back end, all those kind of things at the same time. URLs and UX is another form of migration. And again, people tend to think because it's not involving the domain, it's much lower risk. Actually, there's a huge risk involved in changing the structure of your site. And it's almost inevitable that you will get some hit to your traffic. The point of an SEO project is to make sure that that hit is very short term and as shallow as it possibly can be. And you'll see later as well, the timing of the migration is critical in that respect too. Then there's HTTPS, and we put a grade in there because it's a little bit of a short, sharp shock on that one. And we talk to sites all the time that seem to equate, or their technical teams seem to equate HTTPS migration with literally flicking a light switch. It's easy, you know, all you're doing is adding something into the domain, it's perfect, you know, just there you go, off we go. The risks are enormous, and there are many, many things, you'd be surprised, there are many things to cover off in there to make sure that that process itself is seamless. Google can see HTTPS almost as a separate site. So you need to have a full transition strategy. You need to migrate the URLs. You need to make sure that all your legacy URLs are pointing to the new ones and potentially tidy up a lot of scenarios that may be taking place on your site. Duplication is a huge risk. Anyone with sort of SEO head-on will know that the words SEO, you know, duplication and cannibalization are the bogeymen of the industry. But there's huge risk involved in that, and rarely there's enough planning behind it. Then we've got CMS coding and design, and I think that's especially relevant with David from Magento in the room. He's going to talk a lot more about those kind of replatforming processes and the risk and opportunity surrounding that. Well, let's put a tiny bit more detail on that. So we've got the big three migrations, domain, URL, and HTTP to HTTPS. But within that, there are going to be various layers of complexity. And again, you tend to find that a lot of these aren't given due consideration in a migration process, and all of them can be critical to the outcome. So for example, is your site local or global? If it's sort of global or international, you're going to have multilingual, multiple markets involved. You might be moving from a top global domain down to top level country domains, or you might be doing the reverse process. And there are a huge number of considerations in there. First of all, in domain choice and domain structure choices. And there's going to be huge variation potentially in how your websites appear in different countries, different search engines, to different audiences. All that has to be taken into consideration. Then there's the URL structures and how you best structure the new URLs and then transition the old ones into the new ones. Some sites will also be going from, they'll be consolidating their page or URL footprint. So how do you make sure all the equity from, say, 5 original pages is transferred through to the one consolidated page you end up with? So lots of stuff to consider there. Also, when moving to HTTPS or doing it under of the major migrations, you might also be combining it with other improvements like page speed, mobile readiness, even sort of voice search and various other things that are upcoming. Again, all of these improvements need to be factored into the migration to make sure they're a benefit and not a hindrance. And as you can see, with so many moving parts, the question arises, Do you take that big bang approach and do everything all at once, which can put enormous strain on your technical teams, on your search team, and of course on any expert you might bring in to assist you? Or do you actually split that process out and doing over a number of months? And you'll see in a minute with the timing of that, we've modeled out 2 scenarios of the big bang and a staged migration, and that's based on a real world scenario, and you'll see a strong case behind that. So the next 3 slides are going to be talking about judging risk within a migration. And really the rest of the deck is going to be talking about how you go into more and more granular detail about that. So we've used an example of Churchill here. This is actually quite a strong story here, because as you can see, Churchill are ranking highly, certainly on their brand terms and brand plus, but they're also ranking relatively highly on a lot of generic insurance-related terms. You can also see there's lots of background movement. This is a month-to-month comparison, and there are phrases going up, there are phrases going down. So when you migrate, how do you distinguish that background movement of your rankings and traffic from what is actually going on with the migration process itself? So that certainly is a key part of the modelling there. But also imagine things like, not so sure about dog insurance, it probably is quite valuable, but the car insurance and some of these other phrases, they'll have relatively high CTR. All you have to do is drop 1 or 2 places in the search engines to see a massive reduction in your click-through rates and a huge reduction in traffic, sales, engagement, and so on. And if you cumulatively spread that decline out over thousands of ranked keywords, you can see that the threat to your sales process and your revenue could be absolutely enormous. And again, we've got a scenario that spells out what that might mean a little later on. So that's a really high risk site where the site is dependent on a lot of non-brand, highly competitive keywords to generate revenue. So here we've got a slide specced out on moderate risk. Now what we've taken as an example here is a subdomain, because often many sites will have a considerable number of subdomains and they rarely get consideration within a migration process. But as you can see here, this particular subdomain, it's got a bit of a choppy history. This is a visibility score in search, but it's got a reasonably good visibility score, especially at peak periods and latterly. It's got 1,500 keywords ranked in SERP, so there's certainly some considerable traffic coming in to that site. It's also got a number of links, some of which are high equity links, and it's got reasonable engagement in social platforms. Obviously, the main domain is going to have a lot more, but if you sort of trash your subdomains during the migration process, you could inadvertently be losing a lot of traffic. So we class this as a moderate risk, and again have a mitigating strategy for subdomains as well as domains. And then there's the strategic consideration. What do you do with them all? Do you migrate from subdomain to subdomain, or do you pump that all up into your new top level domain? And then there's the low risk. So I haven't talked much about opportunity, and you might be led to believe from a lot of these presentations that it's all about the threat. And in fact, if you're already top of the rankings in your industry, the likelihood is that you're not going to increase much further, and the best case scenario is to maintain your rankings. But this site is a case of the opposite. You can see that they have no rankings on page 1. Their rankings are distributed largely on page 3 to 10. There may be many issues around that. It could be their search equity, it could be that their technical SEO is poor, it could be their content is duplicate, or they're not working well on mobile devices. So in this scenario, migration could be a great opportunity to fix the multiplicity of issues that this site has. And it could be by combining many pages into a single page, you actually have you go from a low average ranking to a much higher ranking during the migration process. So there are scenarios where opportunity certainly can be the result of migration. So these are the 2 scenarios that I talked about a minute ago. So at the top we see a big bang migration involving domain, URLs and HTTPS all happening at the same time. Incidentally, this particular case that we've drawn from a number of real client scenarios, they're also changing their front end, their back end, replatforming, doing the UX, rewriting their content, doing like everything under the sun. So that's quite a complex process. This data spans over 2 years, and you can see that through the migration process, the recovery time is typically 3, 6, or even 9 months. And doing everything all at once in a big bang approach, yes, they've timed it right because they've started the project just at the tail end of a peak. So that's a really good piece of planning there. But the decline is so deep and so prolonged that it eats into the next peak sales period. So that, I would say, is a high risk to that particular business there. Later on, it does realign. About a year later, you're realigned with what would have been your trajectory in search. But in the meantime, you've lost a considerable amount of traction and potentially revenue. In the bottom scenario, we tackle the URL migration first, and then we wait 6 months for the equity to flow down to the new pages, and then we tackle the domain and the HTTPS. Now, many sites are being pushed by Google to do that early, and there are some very good reasons why you do that, especially for e-commerce. You should probably do that sooner rather than later if you haven't already done that. But in this scenario, it's largely an information inquiry-based site as opposed to a transactional site, and it's been judged that the risk is actually greater of doing the HTTPS along with the URL migration. So we've got URLs first. And you can see that actually the decline is relatively shallow and short-lived in this scenario. The equity flows pretty rapidly down to the new URLs if that process is handled correctly. And then when we come to the actual domain migration, you do see a hit there, and it's a bit more prolonged. But again, because it's timed with a major downturn, seasonal downturn in their traffic, the hit to the business is a lot lower. And I'll briefly talk about this one. It's in your modeling process, it's worth going into even more detail than just looking at branded and non-branded terms. So we've looked again at a real client scenario here, and this is very much a brand-driven business at peak times of the year. But underlying that, you also have a high volume of background generic search. And we've classified those into 2 levels. You've got what I call the sort of frothy other terms. That's the stuff that is non-core, not directly related to your sales process. But inevitably, all websites will rank for a lot of stuff that's non-core. And then we've got these so-called priority terms. These are the ones that research shows drive engagement and inquiries and sales. Now, unless you've differentiated your language and you understand what's driving positive user engagement and what's driving sales, you'll be looking at all this generic search as of equal value. And you may spend considerable time trying to save it all. That's not going to happen. During a migration process, it's almost always the case that the frothy terms, the accidental rankings, the unconscious keywords you rank for, are going to decline because you may not be migrating that content over. You'll probably be losing that along the process. That probably doesn't matter. And if you see the stats afterwards and you see your traffic falling off a cliff, you might freak out at that. But if we understand that we've retained the core phrases that drive the business and drive inquiries, you will almost certainly see that inquiries haven't dropped and actually you've cleaned up your URL footprint and your site traffic. So setting that expectation with stakeholders and at board level, I think, is absolutely critical to understand what's going on. There'll be other changes as well, cyclical changes. Your brand may be in ascendancy or decline. You need to understand what those long-term cyclical trends are, both on brand terms and generic, in order to factor those in so you're not misinterpreting a decline during migration with what actually is an underlying trend. There may also be demographic shifts, difference in engagement patterns, and of course movement over to devices like mobile first, and the rumoured mobile only type stuff. So again, you need to have a good idea of what those long-term trends are to interpret what happens once you migrate. So what do you need to focus on when you're doing your migration planning? Obviously there's hundreds of things, but I think these are 3 core areas. You need to look at individual pages. Which pages are directly driving traffic to your site in terms of high rankings, but also sales, of course. You need to look at which pages are critical to your users engaging with the site, critical to those journeys which lead to sales and inquiries. You need to break down the language of your business into what's actually working and at different stages, both the research stage, consideration, and purchase stages. If you've mapped your language to your sales funnel, then the migration is not going to be such a confusing process. You're going to be able to tell exactly what's going on. And then one thing that's almost always left out of a migration process, you should actually map your user journeys themselves. So much is going to be changing during the migration process. You want to make sure that the key user journeys and experience actually transition over to the new site. So as well as a hit on rankings, you're not also getting a sort of UX or user engagement hit. And this is almost the last slide. I've saved the most boring one till last. Difficult to see perhaps on the screen there, but what it's telling is a simple story that sort of sums up what we've been talking about. Too often migration processes will be looking at traffic and volume, and they won't differentiate between that and the underlying causes. So we can see here this SEO gap potential, the migration risk in sort of that column, the first column there that's coloured in red. If you don't have an understanding of what is the most beneficial traffic and keywords to your site, you may think that the other searches present the highest risk from migration, and in fact they do. And if your value you're putting on each individual user, that would also seem to be the greatest monetary risk. But if you understand that actually those phrases aren't the ones that are converting and driving user engagement, and we rejig those figures, you'll see the last two columns have a much more representative view of your site and what you should be focusing on, and that should be the prioritization for migration planning. We should be looking at where the converting risk is, and we should be looking at the monetary risk associated with that converting traffic and that converting language. And here you get a very different profile. Even though brand terms are the ones that are least likely to drop during a migration process, the fact is the CTR, the conversion rate, are considerably higher for them. So actually a small drop, a 10% drop in your brand and brand plus, could lead to the largest hit on revenue that you actually have during a migration process. You'll also see the other stuff that often gets left out because it's very hard to map. The priority terms and the long tail terms also could have a huge hit on your site. So in the migration planning, we want to make sure we understand all this underlying data to plan correctly and avoid nasty shocks and misdirected, wasted effort during the process. And here's my last bit. So this is at least a starting point for a migration checklist. So we think you should work back from outcomes. So don't get blinded by traffic and volume. You should work back from what you actually want to achieve. Typically that is going to be maintaining sales, maintaining rankings, maintaining traffic. We think it's advisable to engage with experts. Even if you have a strong internal technical team, even if you have SEO people on your team, we think having a second pair of eyes on the problem, working with somebody who has done multiple migrations with minimal or no loss of traffic, we think is a sensible thing to do. It's just the process is so incredibly complex and there's so many ways in which the wheels can come off. We think this process of risk and opportunity modelling is fundamental. So it's not just about planning the technical stages in your migration, it's about knowing all the potential risks and then being able to mitigate against them. As you see, there's lots of moving parts, so you need to choose a scenario and then map that out. And again, we're not suggesting the big bang approach because that is the most high risk approach to migration. Building a team, aligning it to sales objectives is critical, and actually the next presentation talks a lot more, and in a fairly humorous vein, sorry, no jokes in my one, and they talk a lot more about those scenarios and mapping them out, building the teams, and then creating a framework. Again, typically that framework will be created for your technical teams and your SEO teams, but actually creating a framework of communication for stakeholders we think is especially important. You need to carry them through that process, typically because they will not understand migrations or be that interested in the minutiae of that. But they will be very interested if a traffic drops off a cliff at some point during the process. Then we need to have realistic timescales and map those tasks against timescales. Again, we've been involved in migrations where you have the biggest, lumpiest tasks which get left right until the end, and then people scrabble around trying to fix them. And if you're rushing to complete complex tasks at scale, that is when mistakes are more likely to happen. We would tend to divide the migration process into pre-migration, go-live, and post-migration priorities, and you can have pretty extensive checklists around those. When it comes to actual go-live, we've actually slept in clients' offices to be there during the migration process And that's an idea to do that, so you have that mitigation strategy ready to go just in case. And that leads us on to planning for the best and worst case scenarios. Even though we're working towards mitigating the disaster scenario, you may experience some loss of traffic, and that may be critical to your business. So having something like a PPC campaign or other sort of above the line or media campaigns ready to go just in case is a good insurance policy. And sometimes it's good to have an agency on your side helping you to build out those scenarios, even if it turns out you don't need to use them. And the big one, of course, is measurement impacts. Measure, measure, measure before and after the process. And then the last one, I think, is end on a positive note. Some of the work you do as part of migration will be looking to the future of your site and growing it for the next sort of 3-5 years. So having a growth plan ready to go and implementing some of the aspects of that growth plan during the migration is certainly something that is a good idea to do as well.